Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian. I'm the host of the Left of Greg show. You're going to be watching the video version of our audio podcast. Please, guys, if you like the video, like it, subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more content down there if you're already a subscriber, and a better way for us to get you guys some more stuff. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. Check out our links down below to get a hold of us and to actually find out more places where you can get more information about this. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook at HBPRNA. Remember, all these cases that we discuss and all these discussions that we have are through the lenses of what we call human behavior, pattern recognition, and analysis. So please like it, share it, tell your friends about it, and we hope you enjoy the show. Thanks. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Steve, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate you joining us here on Easter Monday, and when we're recording this. So I guess that's the thing now. I didn't know, but it's on all of our calendars. So we were all prepping, going, "Hey, what do we have on Easter Monday? How is that different?" So we appreciate you coming on, man. Thanks so much. So I'd love to just kind of jump right in and start off by actually kind of give us a little story about how you got on here, because you know John McCaskill, who we had on the past, but you have past, I'll say, experience with Greg. So I'll let you kind of start with that. And if you need to, show me on the doll where he touched you, we can do that if we need to. I don't know what kind of experience it was. So why don't you go ahead and jump in.
He won't be the first SEAL that can do that, actually. So.
Yeah. I'm happy to be here, guys. Carve out a little bit of time on my busy Easter Monday. But yeah, so John and I worked together at SEAL Team 10 back in the day. And so I'm going to probably be doing stuff with him a little bit later too. But, I remember I saw you present down, I think it was called Soft Week in Savannah back in 2012, 2013, something like that. And then you came to our command probably, maybe 6 months later, if I have that right. Again, my brain's a little bit hazy from those days. But yeah, and so I actually reached out to you guys to see if I could come on, and I had no agenda in terms of what I want to talk about, but I just feel like what you guys talk about is so damn fascinating that I'm just want to see where this conversation is going to go, because no matter where it goes, I know it'll be interesting for me, at least.
Well, just so you know, I've got an immense head, and with it goes an immense memory, Stephen. And so not only do I remember being in Savannah for that, I'd love to tell our viewing and listening audience that those type of opportunities come up all the time, but they don't. The dude that spoke just before me, don't remember his first name, but his last name was Diamond, and he was hawking a book about negotiations and how, the spirit of the SEALs, being in a foreign country, and specifically at that time, the village stability operations in Afghanistan. We were all, if you remember, we were all just shipping to Afghanistan. And so this guy Diamond with his book was fascinating. And so the other thing is, when we came out to SEAL Team 10, two things happened. One, nobody would let us in the gate. And there was this big fence that was around it with the grass, and we had to stand in the parking lot, and it said, "Stand here by the camera." And who was ever pulling the duty that night wasn't letting us in. So we were standing out there in a windy, blustery rain until a SEAL came by, and the SEAL goes, "Hey, what are you guys doing standing out here?" And he let us in. So I found out later who that was during your training, which was great training. We had a ball. A Master Chief walked by and said something like, "Hey, you can't be in a hallway unescorted." A real bright guy that was real happy to see me there. And I said, "Hey, thanks there, Master Chief." And he turned and he got right up in my grill and said, "That's Senior Master Chief." Because, of course, the greatest thing that you learn from human behavior profile is the naval rank system. You get what I'm trying to say? It was fun because that there's a lot of people that don't understand what we do, so they resent it. And if they're not invited to the class, they get pissed because they're on the outside. So I remember that one well, and it's good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks. And my only regret was, in the role I was in, I kept getting pulled out, and I'm like, this is the one thing that I really, really want to sit through. And I got pulled out and wasn't able to get a lot of it. So I was very disappointed in that. But we did. We also sent some guys down to your ASAT course, and they came back just saying great things. So yeah, that's the background.
Well, the funny thing was, if you recall, Stephen, the guy I was with, and the way 10 is set up is you've got that like hallway down in the center that looks almost like a factory with all the gear and stuff. You guys were racking and stacking everything to get it ready to go. And I was with call sign Hook, we'll just call it that. And he was voluntold to meet me there because I had just flown back in from Afghanistan. I was doing some fob bouncing and came back in. And you were the one that they were dragging out. You still had your fingertips on the door, and you kept peeking around the corner to get the next gem of wisdom. I wasn't laying down much gems, but the program was pretty good at the time.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. The guys really liked it too. So
we always enjoy doing the SEALs.
Yeah, and it's great because I think I will say that one of the things that we do well in the SEAL teams is we recognize expertise, regardless of who it's coming from, where it's coming from, and if there's a way that we can adapt that, mold that, and apply it towards the challenges and the problems that we face, then we're definitely always willing to entertain to take that on board.
No, Steve, that's a great point, because that's always my thing when I always say, like, I love when I said training SEALs, because it was always like one, there was just like this level of like I wasn't sure whether I was going to get whether it was going to be a homicide and I wasn't ever walking out of there again, or if it was but there was like this level of a challenge. But it was really great. We had my experience one time down with one of the teams on the West Coast was, we were teaching, it was like the morning of day one. So it was like the first day, and we're going through, we did our intro and all that. And I'm getting, like, the whole time I'm up there, I'm getting like a little nervous because I'm getting like a lot of like anger cues. I'm picking up, people are kind of getting upset and stuff. And I'm like, well, this isn't starting off well. So we go to the first break, and then their chief was like, hey, Brian, can you give me can we take like 30 minutes on this break? And I'm like, yeah, okay. So, I'm like, maybe something came up behind the scenes, I don't know about, whatever, right? So then he comes back with like 15 more guys who had just finished up SQT and shown up to the team, and told them to sit down and write down everything that we were saying. And I was like, holy crap. And so what I found out later is he was like, hey, man, we're really pissed because we're supposed to be we're supposed to be the best trained. And no one ever taught us this. No one taught us this. And like, we're fucking pissed. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, that's really cool. Cause I thought it was going to be like a murder situation where I wasn't getting out of here alive. So, but it was that same attitude. It was really cool. It was like, they were like, no, like, and I walked around during the break and saw some of the guys with their notebooks out. And it was like the most meticulous and organized notes that I'd ever seen. And I was just blown away. And I was like, wow, that's so cool that they're just eating it up and enjoying it, and getting a lot of value out of it.
Right. And I think guys are always going to sniff guys out, size guys up, or gals, whatever. And say, all right, is this guy, does he know what he's talking about? Is this some value? And if that's the case, then they're on board, right? It's like anything, right? It's a tough crowd to maybe break the ice with, but once you do, they're pretty much.
Yeah. And that's why I was,
and once you're welcomed in, once you know the secret handshake, you're in. What I remember is, well, you had a cardboard box, and I found this at not just one SEAL HQ. And when everybody was coming in, that's where the cell phones went. You didn't have time to be texting and talking and everything in class. Uber discipline. Everybody was focused on the mission at hand. Everybody was interacting and asking the right questions. I was asked one time, what's the difference between East and West Coast SEALs? And because we did a lot of training in Coronado, and then with the EOD naval units out in San Diego. And I would say this: I would say the beer and the food was too close out on the West Coast, because every single time that somebody was going to take a lunch break, we always ended up at that same damn place that served way too good a beer and seafood, and that's never good. Training lasted a lot longer on those days, I recall.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say Danny's, but yeah.
Oh, no. Marin and I, we were training in a place, and I can't tell you where, Steve, but there was a SEAL there, and had a little frog pendant, and he was making sure that he was laying down who he was, but he was off the clock now. And he said, hey, listen, I own a bar, and I'll give you. It was in a southern state along the border. That's all I'll tell you. And we were doing Bortak and Borstar and some other folks. And he goes, listen, you guys come by my place after this. You're always welcome. And, we knew him back when he was in there, and he goes, you'll never pay a penny out of your pocket. So we had a couple friends with us, and we stop in, and he recognizes us right away, and he sits down with us. And he came by. Marin, what was it? He gave us like root beer schnapps or something. He gave us like a symbol of root beer schnapps, and he goes, "Hey, everything's on the house," and we were dying. And so we chugged that forthwith. And he comes over and sits with us, and I go, "Hey, will you have one?" And he drinks it, and he goes, "Hey, this is shitty. Who gave you this?" And we're like, "You did, you bastard!" You know, we had so much fun because his cheap nature, but his welcoming nature came through loud and clear.
It was hilarious. Absolutely,
it really
hilarious.
was.
Yeah. Well, so Steve, like you did a lot of time in the SEAL teams in the Navy. So obviously there's a ton of experience from that, and now you've taken a lot of that and you do a lot of kind of I don't know how you want to describe it, but there's a lot of leadership training. There's a lot of stuff you're doing with private companies now to kind of bring in a lot of the mindset and the mental toughness training. But a lot of it comes from you actually helped develop something for the Navy called the Warrior Toughness Program, right? And you actually wrote and did that with a bunch of other folks, and then brought that in up there, I think at Great Lakes. I'm not sure, so correct me if I'm wrong. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that program and kind of what it entails? Because it's a pretty cool approach, because it's not just, I mean, you know it, man. It's not just, hey, who's the hardest dude in the room? It's no, let's develop all these different areas, right, to become that ultimate warrior, that tough warrior.
Yeah, and so specifically, this was for the Navy that I developed, not specific to the SEAL teams, as sometimes that gets confused. So I left the SEAL teams in 2015 and took a billet, which was a SEAL billet up in Great Lakes, the Navy's boot camp. And up there, I was what was called the dive motivator. It was my job to kind of help with the onboarding of all SEAL candidates, diver candidates, air rescue swimmer candidates would come into the Navy under a contract. And it was our job to kind of train them, give them the running and the swimming, but also the mentoring piece. And then in 2017, I was tasked, right, with getting together with a Navy chaplain and a Navy clinical psychologist and said, hey, we need to make our sailors tougher. We need to make them be able to perform under extreme situations. You know, should we go to war with the near peer adversary, open seas, naval combat again? And so we're like, all right. So we approached this from kind of the body, mind, soul way of viewing things. And so obviously, like any military fighting man or woman, they've got to be physically fit. Okay. So there's that aspect of it. So with that is hard training, is a brilliance on the basics combined with, realistic scenario-based training. And then there is the mental component where we talk about performance psychology and mindfulness, meditation, that type of things. And we actually teach them how to do that. And there's also the character development component, the soul approach. And so it's really your character, because you need men and women who can perform and fight the enemy, but they need to be people of good moral and ethical decision making. And they need to make sure that their behaviors and actions align with the beliefs and values of the organization. And when they get stressed, when things get hard, they have the ability, the spiritual toughness to lean into the sources which provide strength. Though it's not a religious program, if you are religious, that would be something that you would lean into. But you'd also lean into connections and relationships, because we don't do hard things by ourselves on our own,
right? Not
effectively. So that's in a nutshell what it was. Yeah.
And that to me is one, it's really cool, and you could speak to this even more than I can. But it's amazing to see how that stuff has come about. Like you said, you did that in 2015. Now, a lot of it is how we articulate these issues. So you go body, mind, and soul. Hey, this is about character, because you can give someone all the training in the world and all the education in the world on a certain area or a certain way to do things, but that doesn't necessarily mean under pressure it's going to come out that way, unless you're developing them, like you said, and people call it emotional maturity and the ability to do all this stuff. So it's just interesting to really see how all this stuff has changed. And now, once that change occurs, it starts to happen more rapidly. But that's totally different than when you first came in the Navy, or when I first went in the Marine Corps, where it was just, hey man, like, I came in when there was a war going on. So it was like hey, we're going to war. This is what's going on. Either you're part of part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And there wasn't that time for development, but it's really, I just think it's cool to see how the military in different areas has evolved to go, hey, what do we really need to focus on to develop our people? Because that's what it's all about. It's all about personal development with someone that's going to make that team stronger. I mean, does it really matter if they get like a 90% or 100% on their PT test if they can't effectively make decisions under stress? Like, where are we really need to focus on? So I'm sure you've seen that change a lot in your career.
Well, I mean, from my own experience, initially you start off, anytime you have a process, a selection process, you weed out a certain amount of people that are clearly unsuitable, right?
Right.
And so you get rid of that. But even through that process, so the initial part of our selection process of BUDS, basic underwater demolition SEAL training, is that first part where it's all about your toughness, right? Your ability to deal with the physical elements, but using your mental strength to be able to get you through those tough times. And so it's like, yes, I can keep going. I can keep going no matter how bad I'm hurting. But then towards the second phase and dive phase, that's when they start to kind of throw the acute stress at you. So you're under the water with your scuba gear, they call it pull comp, and you have to problem solve and stay very composed and not panic. And that requires a different level of mental engagement. But even with all that said, once you get to the SEAL team, in fact, almost every platoon, every troop that I was with, we always got rid of at least one person, because even after making it through all the training, and you're talking about it's at least a year of training before they even show up and get in their first SEAL platoon, they still, once we start doing things at a high rate of speed, there's still a lot of them that don't have that ability to kind of pick it up and do everything safely as we need it to be. And back then, I wasn't given any of the performance psychology techniques, but
Right.
certain things through wisdom and experience and effective training, those things start to become more intuitive. The things such as your mental rehearsal, how you set goals, how you kind of have your own strategies for lowering your arousal, right? Your energy to deal with, so you can make those clear, more composed decisions under stress.
Yeah. One of the things, first of all, shout out to my dear friend, Admiral Harwood, and thanks for your service, Steve, and for all the SEALs and naval folks that went before. Not as much the Marines, but definitely the Army. The one thing is that I notice a lot is people misattribute lexicon, certain words. And Brian and I have found that sometimes when people talk about human performance, they're only thinking about human physical performance and mental performance and your mental acuity and your ability. Like you used the term mindfulness, and McCaskill used the term, and a lot of our friends use that now. That term's been around forever. As a matter of fact, situational awareness is mindfulness. It's the same thing. So we're all in that together. And being able to expand one's mental clarity to include external arousal and novel stimulus and still be able to overcome it. That's what human performance is about. And an increase in human performance is just every bit as important as the physical rigors that SEALs put on themselves and all warriors have to do. Wouldn't you agree with that?
100%, and it's, initially when we started, we rolled out this Warrior Toughness program. We're not worried about the recruits getting it. We're not worried about the younger, more junior personnel getting it. They're like, all right, well, this is what you do. Then okay, we're just going to do it. It's the people that have been around, the people that have already established those habits. And they're like, all right, I already got this. Well, what they didn't realize is that people who perform at the highest levels, whether it's military, law enforcement, special operations, or athletics, elite athletes and organizations, they all realize that no matter how good I am, to your point, physically, no matter how focused I can be, I can always get better. And what's going to give me the edge, what's going to certainly optimize my performance, is that investment into the mental side. And then just in terms of simply making it through BUDS, it's that old cliche. And Brian, I'm sure you've heard that before too, right? It's 90% mental, getting through BUDS training. Obviously you got to be in good shape, but it's the mental piece it's the difference maker.
Right. And there's all these different terms that we use, and like Greg said, like you were saying, how we articulate stuff about resilience, and then there's grit, and then there's this, and I it's just interesting to me to see how it's progressed to now. Like we got guys like you said, before you talk to a performance psychologist, you already had tacit knowledge, right? You had experience that you're like, I know what this is. And then when someone comes along and puts words to it, well, holy crap, now we can transfer that
Eureka.
skill set, right? Now it's like, oh, I have the you know, the explicit knowledge that you can teach and study and read in a book, plus my tacit knowledge from all my life experience that I can put into that experiential learning process to actually take all the lessons learned. Because I think a lot of times we miss a lot of, well, we're getting better at it, but we've always missed a lot of the pulling out the true lessons learned from different events or different situations, where we like to place blame or say, if this wouldn't have happened, or if this person wouldn't have done this, we just need to train that now, and then this won't happen again. It's like, well, let's dig a little bit deeper here and look at these different lessons learned, and who's the actual person, what type of individual do we want, you know, making the decision at that time and place. What does that involve? And I think everything's slowly going towards that, and I really like it, and it's kind of cool that you guys have that. And so I know you're now kind of taking a lot of that knowledge and stuff, and you're going to private companies and you're speaking at different places, and you're doing training, I believe, too, for some of these organizations. So what is it about that you're doing right now? Like, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think in anything that we do in the military, you can highlight you use the hyperbole, right? When bullets are flying, and I'm certainly guilty of that myself, but there is a translation.
Yeah.
I think, and I think is you guys are both had so much time around the military that you would recognize, I think, that one of the things that we bring is structure, is framework, is process to how we approach problem sets. And so when we developed this Warrior Toughness program, it was about bringing a couple of things. It was about, first, it's got to be comprehensive. It's got to be holistic. So just like you do military planning, you start with the concept, and you walk that all the way through to the after action review process and everything in between. And so, but we also wanted to bring with that a level of consistency. And so while I mentioned that certain things were intuitive to me, what I lacked and what was very important that I brought to this program was how to apply this consistently. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. So I could feel like I could maintain my composure and my critical thinking skills on operations, right? In the combat or training. But yet when I get home and the kids are behind me chirping or
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting stressed out, and I didn't have that same level. I didn't have the consistency there. And so it was really important that I'm like, all right, well, if I can take a skill set and make sure that I apply it deliberately for all those situations where the amygdala starts to kick in, whether it's anger, fear, frustration, if I can apply that, if I can make a approach in a consistent manner, I'm going to be more effective in all of those areas. And so when I approach organizations, I try to say, okay, these are the extreme examples. Now here's exactly how you can use it. When we face a challenge, let's bring a framework. And the framework that I use is commit, prepare, execute, and reflect. And that basically is a pretty complete framework. It starts with commit. You've got to be all in. You've got to know exactly to make sure your behaviors and actions are aligned with the goals. When you prepare, it's figuring out those core skills that you need. It's sharpening your mental game. When you get to the execute part, it's about having agility. It's about having situational awareness. And then lastly, it's your ability to really distill the value from your experiences and not just say, all right, I got it, but to intentionally put that into a plan to execute better the next time around and not get mired down in the negativity with the emotional baggage when we don't execute well.
The magic of that too is that most agencies that we run into, when an agency finds itself lacking, there are key prominent features that they might not be able to see internally, that externally, all of a sudden, the battlefield to the boardroom, you go, hey, wait a minute, here's a stress fracture that you might have to work on. And one of those is institutional memory. And Brian and I harp on this all the time, that the sage graybeards passing down that gem of knowledge, sometimes the new generation doesn't have time for it. They don't want to see it. So that structure, that framework, make sure that those gems don't slip through the cracks, because when we're shaking that sieve and trying to get the rocks out of the sand, we have to think in our fragile ecosystems that we're the first people that came up with this epiphany, that this moment is ours. We're the only people that have ever been at war. And I remember, you guys might remember Don Yeager, God bless Don, and his dad, Chuck Yeager, and his son, Kip Yeager, hero of Fallujah.
Three generations of
Three generations of warriors. And so Don Yeager's hero of the Central Highlands, 173rd in Vietnam, and just surly as they come, looks like Ho Chi Minh now. He's all old and lives about an hour from me. I only see him about once a year foraging for food in town, and then if you startle him, he'll run off like a scared deer. And we were sitting there, and this kid had just come back from Kinetic, Iraq, and I was going into Kinetic, Iraq, so we had him come up and do our intro for one of our briefs on Pendleton. And the kid said it's nothing like anybody in America has ever encountered. We use one trail, the next day we go back, and there's IEDs on that trail, and they're shooting at us with AKs and their sniper rifles, SVDs. And Yeager stops him and goes, "Hey, asshole, we were doing that in the Central Highlands," and he's shaking the kid, and they're actually getting in a tussle on stage. Why? Because we think that each generation doesn't face the same problems, and I think that's a huge part of the root of the fabric of an organization. If they don't listen early on, and if they don't build a framework that incorporates that history, those hot washes, those after action reviews, they're going to miss something. And most times it's going to be something critical, simple yet critical.
Well, and I look at that sometimes when I talk about situational awareness, it's that I feel like, kind of to your point, is sometimes we get sucked into the minutia. Yep. We're looking at, like, as we say, the 5-meter target. And yep. So whether that's just the immediate actions we need to take, it's fussing with all the gear that's supposed to make our lives easier, but typically is an added encumbrance. And we kind of become disconnected at what the overall theme is. And so when you have frameworks, it's about keeping you tied to what your overarching goal is.
Yes,
exactly. And we saw that in Iraq sometimes. I remember coming in, the latter part of, 07, 08, we were very much trying to get, support the awakening movement, right? Where you have the Sunnis who are now really like, hey, we're the enemy of Al Qaeda, which are Sunnis as well. And so we're trying to support that. And then you have, an Army strike force that come in and basically just shot up a whole bunch of those dudes, and not judging them. I mean, they made a call based on what it was, not trying to lay fault. But when things like that, when the tactical objective, it really undermines the strategic objective. And I feel like those are things we always have to keep in mind, and from at any organization.
No, that's a great point. You brought up something like, hey, we're so focused on that 5-meter target, and same thing. I call it, and I do this in a lot of the resiliency stuff and talking about different like PTSD and working through different issues and stuff, is that I used to live my life. I call it living your life at your front sight tip. I mean, when you pull that thing out and you're shooting, what are you focused on? Front sight, front sight, front sight. That's all you see, and you're living your whole life that way, man, it can go catastrophically wrong real fast, because you have no idea what you're actually getting yourself into. And you brought up a couple examples too. I mean, just some great gems. If you were, I remember same thing. I was 07 working with the Awakening folks. I was out in Ambar, out in Ramadi, and I remember we had this. We got a platoon of I forget what they called them. I don't know what unit they were, but they were just special operations force from Iraq, and they were awesome dudes, right? And I was like, hey, we got dumped on them. Hey, why don't you take these guys? And I'm like, hey guys, like, we're trying to talk to the interpreter, like, where are you guys from? We're who do you typically work with? And they're like, oh, we work with the Navy. And I'm looking at them, I was like, oh, all right, I know if you're saying the Navy, I know what that means, right? So they clearly they're trained by SEALs. Whatever. These guys were awesome, and I was talking to them, trying to build that rapport, because we're going to go run some ambush operations along a couple different areas, and then I was showing them some different hide site stuff and how they could operate at that time differently. Like they could go out and do some vehicle hide stuff, all this cool stuff, and they were digging it. And so we were going through with the interpreter, and I'm like, oh, so where are you guys originally from? And one guy was like, I actually grew up, and up until a few years ago I lived here in Ramadi. And I was like, oh, you're kidding me? And he's like, yeah, and I did this. And I was like, oh, well, what were you doing back in 2004? And he looked right at me, and through the interpreter, he goes, I was shooting at the Americans. And I'm just like, wow, because that was me. Had been in that same city a few years prior, and I'm just like, okay, so here's this guy. He's about my age. Just told me he was shooting at me a few years ago. And now we're running missions together. Like I was, 25-year-old sergeant in the Marine Corps, sniper at the time, team leader, going like, well, if that doesn't explain, geopolitics, if that doesn't explain, the strategic mindset here, like, I don't know what does. Like, it was just incredible. It was a lot to swallow, but it was that same thing, just being able to take a step back and go, what's the overall picture we're trying to do here? And I mean, that spoke to just that that a bunch of that stuff really reminded me of those stories. That was incredible. But it's the same thing. It's taking those lessons learned forward. You know, what am I going to do? Sit here and go, oh yeah, you were shooting at my friends, and I'm like, if I put myself in his shoes, what would I be doing if Iraq came into my neighborhood and took it over? Every day, I'd be with my buddies going, hey, how many Iraqis are we going to kill today? You know what I mean? So I get it. You know, this guy wasn't doing it for ideology at the time. He was just going, you guys came and took over my country. So crazy how that stuff works. But so I know you're taking this into like because you're doing a lot with private sector and stuff now too, because, you know, we do stuff all the time. And our thing is, you know, at first a lot of them are like, well, like, we don't know, like, what you're talking about is military stuff. It doesn't really apply here. And we're like, yeah, okay. We're like, well, this is different. It's like, no, the consequences for being wrong in your end are very different than
you
mine.
got it.
But the problem to us, and I'm sure to people like you, is the same. It's the same issue everywhere. So I'd love to get your kind of view on some of those, maybe those situations you've had where you're trying to go and talk to a private organization, telling them, hey, this is no different than the other things I've learned, or some of those parallels that you've seen between, you know, stuff you had to do on active duty versus now working with a private company.
Well, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, right? You got to be very careful with the language that you use. And so I actually I released a video last week where I talked about kind of the difference between toughness and resilience. Now, granted, everybody's got their own, but we'd brief our program. As our program started getting more popular, we started briefing, you know, senators and senior military folks, et cetera. And they would always be like, is this some kind of resiliency thing? And we would always say, well, no, because resilience is this. And so we were like, all right, well, what's the difference? And so resilience, as we looked it up, you know, people run with it, but it was your ability to bounce back from setback, from challenge, what have you. Whereas what we were talking about was toughness, we identified it in 3 areas. One, your ability to take a hit and keep fighting, your ability to perform under pressure, and your ability to deal with that day in, day out grind, you know, that long deployment. And whereas resilience is absolutely a part of that. But I would be guilty of and I still do, because resilience just is like that warm kind of just sounds good.
Yeah.
We don't want to bring a SEAL in to talk about toughness. That wouldn't play well, maybe.
Yeah.
But if we talk about resiliency, that's going to make, you know, faced a little bit better. One of the things I talk about, I tell a story about how one of my friends who's a pharmaceutical sales rep, when I would go in and I talk to pharma, I talk about this story about how she had this agenda, the sales agenda that she wanted to drive, this doctor she'd been waiting to come in to see, and finally gets a meeting with this guy. And she's so ready to just, you know, drive out that game plan. But then she realizes, like, this doctor is so busy, patients lined up outside the door, stuff piled up on his desk. And she actually has the awareness to stop and say, you know what, like, what is in the value of my customer right now? How can I, with the long game in mind, give some value here? And that value was simply to say, I'm going to come back again another time. I'll drive the 3 hours back to Chicago, you know, and so it's our ability to just, regardless of whether you're going to get shot at or whether you have a pitch or a contentious leadership situation, you need to be, when you're on the X, as we say, you need to be able to think critically. You need to be able to think clearly. You need to not be emotionally hijacked, and keep in mind where that desired outcome is, where you want to take that engagement, and drive the behavior towards that.
Yeah, many times when we're dealing with a company, you know, like we were dealing with healthcare, and so we're in briefing the healthcare folks. They get done with the briefing, and every single one of their folks that were in the briefings that we did over this couple of days come back and go, we need more of this. We're not even sure exactly what it is yet, but holy crap, where's this been hiding? Which is the most common comment that we get when we're training pre-deployment folks. And then we go up to the single point of friction, the single point of failure, the person that's writing the check, and he goes, I don't know, it seems a little too military for my taste. Okay, got it. And so then you go to the schools, and the schools sit down and they get the brief, and you're saying, so we're going to increase resilience, up armor the mental toughness. We're going to create advanced critical thinking skills in all your people. But what are we going to do for when the guy comes in the room and he's already shooting? And we're going like, well, time out for school shooters. We're going to be identifying them well left of bank, pre-event indications, and they'll coalesce in these clusters of cues. And they go, yeah, but this other guy, they're booting doors and ramming cars, and that's really fun. And then, we're at Muscatatuck, and we're a day before Christmas this past year, and we're watching the show. Muscatatuck's got a great show. Yeah. And I remember a wonderful SEAL, Adam Shapiro, a lieutenant commander, probably a commander by now. And Shapiro comes up and he goes, "You know what the problem is?" And I go, "Yeah, I'm pretty well aware." And he goes, "The problem is that over there they're doing plasma charges. Over here they're doing explosive breaching. Over there they're doing live tissue testing. And you're saying, hey, let's sit down for a minute and let's talk about what's going on in here." And nobody wants to hear that. So two-pronged thing here. One, legal, moral, and ethical. It's as misunderstood as the word resilience is, okay? And LME, every time we go into a place and stress LME, they go, "Well, don't worry about that. We've got an ethics advisor that works with our human resources folks, and we do a 9-question test every other year." One, shut up. You have no idea what you're talking about. And then the second part is that the LME, they don't understand that if you don't have to worry about that, if you unburden yourself from worrying, is my activity legal? Am I acting in an ethical fashion? If you never have to consider that, imagine the scales falling from your eyes and seeing the world for the first time like it really is. And that's what people get out of training. That's one facet of all the many things that they get out of situational awareness training and human behavior pattern recognition analysis and counter suicide. They're all the same training. They're all facets. It's a Fabergé egg. I'm just looking in a different hole. And what you do is essential, but how come it's so hard? Why is it so hard that when you're briefing people, they got a chip on their shoulder and it's just not what they're looking for? How does that make you feel, Steve?
It makes me feel like I need to be very, very deliberate in how I craft that message.
Yeah.
Right.
And lead with the results and say, this is, if you want to be able to do this. And so now, like a lot of my messages, I talk about peak performance because that's what I want, regardless of, here's a framework, regardless of what, the two things you can control, right? Attitude and effort. Now, everything else is maybe beyond your control at times, but you want to be able to have a peak performing performance, right? Regardless of what the circumstances are. And so in our current set of circumstances, I've had to back that off a little bit because people were thinking survival mode in a lot of cases. They're not thinking about necessarily outflanking the competition at this very moment. Some people
Right.
are, but a lot of people are just, they're dug in. And so we want to be able to say, yeah, all right, here's survival, but we still want to have an eye on peak performance because, a good friend of mine used the analogy. He's like, there's so many organizations that are pitting right now, that are coming off the track and they're in the pits and they're hunkered down to kind of wait to see. He's like, you need to figure out how you can stay on the track.
Yep.
And it's going to look different. Outcomes are not going to be what we hope they're going to be, but
Exactly.
we got to stay engaged. We got to stay in the fight. And so I guess I just got to be careful with the language that I use. And that's sometimes different depending on the culture. You have a bunch of guys that are like really pro-military. They bring you in and they're excited, where maybe there's some other folks that don't know anything about the military. They have a lot of misconceptions. And so it's really kind of knowing, how to to speak to those different types of people.
Yeah.
And one of the fights, Brian, that Brian can attest to briefly, law enforcement officers, being a law enforcement officer for such a long time, one of the things is there's this thing between military and law enforcement. Like even now, I'll say, hey, I was in the military and then the law enforcement, but I wasn't an MP. Why? Because that's like an insult to law enforcement people that you started out as an MP. Just like law enforcement hates firemen because they just sit around waiting for the bell to ring. They're not proactive. Well, the same thing was happening when we were on the West Coast, Brian. You'll recall that we were going in these small agencies and we were trying to bring them up to speed on what they're going to expect when a soldier comes home. And if that soldier's a fragile human being and he starts to unwind, this is the knowledge that he knows. So you might have to be prepared for this. And the coppers were sitting there sometimes with the arms crossed, with the distance, with the cigar in, and going, hey, listen, I've been at this 12 years, 15 years, 18 years, 22 years. And you kid, you got one deployment, you're not going to come in. See, sometimes we wear the glasses and we fail to see the forest for the trees because we don't want to accept the knowledge that somebody else is bringing through because it challenges our world state, how we view the rest of the world. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, and the other thing is getting, and I notice kind of with anyone, there's a big difference between education and training. And what you're
Oh
talking
yeah.
about, Steve, is training. Like, all right, how do you get better at critical thinking or making better decisions under stress? Yeah, you can read all the books in the world that you want, man. But like, if you don't put it to a process and put it to a plan and work on that, there's different ways to do that. So our big thing is there's always a difference between education and training. Education is important. Like we read all the books in the world. I do as well. But training changes behavior. So if I don't come up with a process to change the way I'm doing something, it's very, very difficult to read something and then extrapolate the lessons learned and apply it to my life, right? So I need someone to come in. And so with that, I would say, and maybe your experience is similar or different, I don't know, but training with like the private sector is, it's different, and it's not what they think it is, and they look at it, hey, that's a cost rather than that's an investment, right? Training in the military, yeah, is training and readiness expensive? Yeah, to have literally, you're going to pay a whole bunch of dudes and girls to sit around and be ready for something and train for the event. Well, that costs a ton of money, right? So for a private company, it's like, hey, you got to pull these folks out of line and you got to train them up, and it's like, well, that's going to cost us this. They're like, no, that's going to cost you that in the short term, but over the length of their career here, or what you're trying to do, what is the benefit you're going to get out of it? And I think there's there's some organizations that can accept that and go, yeah, you know what, you're right, we need to spin these people up. And there's others that want to do it, that buy the company that sells them the online click-through video thing that my wife, who's worked for all these major companies, goes, this sucks, and just clicks. She's like, this one actually makes me wait 20 minutes before I can go to the next slide. Like, they think I'm going to read it. She's sitting there on Instagram doing that and then going next. Like, so that's not training. That's just checking the box. But the company can go
for their safety.
They can go to their legal team and go, well, look, this person did all this. We gave them the tools. But I think that difference, and that's, I know for us, that's resonated a little bit with folks, where we say, look, there's a difference between training and education, and the light bulb kind of gets a little brighter. But so I don't know if you've seen that too with the private sector on what they're willing to do and not, and how they look at training.
Well, it's like you said. I mean, that online stuff, that's kind of in many cases, it's the military, right? It's the CYA stuff. You've done your trafficking in persons and all that stuff. But you see that also in the organizations. And here's an example. Like a friend of mine, they were out like a few months before this whole thing happened, like right in the beginning of the year, where they did their annual sales training. And so they spend God knows how much to bring in, I don't know which organization it was, the guys that come in with the pilots in the flight suits, and they start, and, a lot of stuff they talk, it's, we can have a laugh, right? But a lot of the stuff they talk about is military process distilled down, and it's good stuff, really. And it's good stuff. And she was telling me, she's like, all right, we're getting all this stuff. We've got this great keynote, and they don't use any of it. They don't even address it. She's like, it would have been a great opportunity to go right into our breakout sessions and start translating these things directly. The one part, we bring in a speaker that we vetted through the agency, or the bureau, and that's good to go. But that's not connected to the actual training plan that's going to execute this thing. So I see a lot of that.
Yeah, we one of the great things about how SEALs train, and not to divulge any secret handshakes out of the shop, but we would go and we would do some classroom stuff. And then the next thing, we're leaving Dam Neck in Virginia Beach, and we're right out on the street. And then we would go from there to a place that's way down south in Texas and hit the tactical implications. And then the next thing you know, we're back in a big city doing it from a hotel room with binos down onto the street. And it was amazing because you could see this change. So Brian and I, thank God, great organizations like Carry the Load, great folks like SEAL Cody Banders. You might remember Cody back in the day, and then Teacher Atkinson down in Dallas, all these good folks. We're down there, and one of the things that we do is we hit this really big business, and during the business, guy takes me off to the side and goes, hey, one of the things that we think that we could use your stuff for, which is amazing to us, is that we don't want to leave money on the boardroom table. And so, you quote the Kansas to Kandahar, which was necessary back in the day, the leave behind. And so I go, hey, it's battlefield to boardroom. It's going to work the same way. And the guy loved that statement. So we sat down and gave him a couple of examples of how human behavior and different cues and these things and how to set up the room. And the guy was amazed. And so call back in a couple of weeks and go, hey, how is that? Something he goes, yeah, but you know what? We got this wait and see. We've heard wait and see more times from folks. And I will be the one to tell you, I've been around longer than both of you combined. The idea is you're going to pay. You and your organization are going to pay one way or the other. You're going to pay in body bags. You're going to pay, one of the things Jim Mattis said, he said it costs $1 million to train up a Marine to send him to combat, and it costs $1 million to keep him there. And if a Marine dies in combat, it costs $1 million to bring him back and do all these other stuff. So I know every drop of blood. I know every drop of sweat. I know the investment of every Marine and their families. And he meant it. I don't think sometimes that we see it as Americans. You get what I'm trying to say? I think that sometimes we lose the eye on the ball and understand that all of this training that we do before the event is going to pay dividends later on. I think we miss that.
Yeah, and I think because a lot of it comes from the lack of commitment that you have, that the employer has to the employee and vice versa.
Absolutely.
So everything's so temporary. There's no gold watch. There's no retirement. And so it's how are you really going to make sure that you're driving the culture that gets somebody to commit, to give you all that they have? And so those are the real challenges, I think, that's different from the military. The military, we don't have to contend with that. We're all in it. Hey, we're going to, maybe we're not excited with what the mission is, but right now I'm going to give the guy to the left and the guy to the right of me, all I have to get through this. And then we don't really have that. So we have to come up with other different creative ways in a professional business culture to garner that level of commitment.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because it is, and we do see companies are like, well, look, like this person could leave tomorrow and go get a different job. This person could do this. I don't know, but yet all those people post that stuff on LinkedIn where it's like, hey, the CFO says to the CEO, what if we train these people and they leave? And then the guy's like, well, what if we don't train them and they stay? And people go, oh, that makes perfect sense. Like, you should invest in your people. And then when it comes down to it, it's like, well, it costs too much. It's like, all right. Yep. But there are some folks who do try to do that and create that culture. And culture to me comes down to that leadership. What's the guy in charge or girl in charge or people in charge? What are they modeling? What are they setting forward as what they want out of that organization? Because people are going to either get on board or they're going to get off, and that's fine. Let the people get off who want to get off, and let people who want to get on, and they're going to drive forward, because that mission, that train's moving down the tracks either way. So there's a lot of issues that the private sector has to deal with, that the military doesn't, and then there's issues that they don't have to deal with, in terms of consequences and budget things that are a lot different. But anytime we have someone like you on, Steve, I always kind of ask, like, what, I asked the same thing to John McCaskill when we had him on, and Michelle Palladine when we had her on, because you teach this stuff, and Andy Reese, same thing. You're a subject matter expert. So what is it that you do? What's your daily routine, or some of the things that you do for this mental toughness, and to not get the emotions get in the way, or the emotions allow you to deal with the event? You know what I mean? How to create that block, and what is it that you specifically do? Like, what is your mindfulness, or what is it that you're every day that you go through? Because there's a few things I do, and I always talk about it with different folks. So I'd love to hear it from your side and what you do as an expert.
Well, in being authentically consistent, I would say, I'll break it down to that body, mind, soul approach. And every day I'm going to do something physical. And these things overlap, obviously, if they're not all clear, separate things. But every day I'm going to make sure. And what I do now is every morning I get up and I go for a walk. It's about a 40-minute walk. And that's good for recovery. That's not my workout, but it's good for recovery. But it's also where I do a lot of I sit there and I walk along, and and I talk to them. I talk out my content. And if somebody comes by, I kind of stop talking.
Right? Pretend you're on the Bluetooth.
Yeah.
Hold the phone. Yeah.
My AirPods in, right. And that's what I do. That's my moment of reflection. It's my moment of content development. And it also gets me, it's also something healthy to do. I heard on another podcast, Brian, you talking about bourbon. I love me some bourbon. Yeah. Right. But I could easily do that every night, but I can't.
Right?
Yeah.
I've got to have that element of self-care, because if I drink bourbon, especially towards the end of the evening, it's going to interrupt my sleep. And so that's part of that, taking care of my body, trying to eat some good food, make sure I work out. And in the mind part, I do my daily, I use my Headspace app, nothing overly complex. And I do usually 10 to 15 minutes meditation. Right now I'm on like the advanced finding focus part, which is good, which the more meditation you do, the more it's just quiet. They reduce the amount of cues that you have, the reminders, the prompts. And then I try to always figure out, when it comes to execution and reflection, I try to figure out, okay, what have you accomplished? It's good to finish your day saying, all right, I've been productive in these areas. And the reflective piece comes in to say, okay, am I being productive in all of the areas? Because I've been guilty of that, like you said, living your life just within the front sight focus, how that negatively impacts the other aspects of your life when it comes to relationships. So right now, am I being productive professionally? Am I being productive as a father, as a husband, and just a leader in my home, and really striving to have that balance? So the physical activity, nutrition, sleep, try to get good sleep, try to make sure that I'm productive every day professionally and, personally, and make sure that I'm taking some time to step out of the noise and just look at how things are going.
Yeah, you mentioned it a couple of times. You keep saying the word consistency, and that's what I always tell people too. It goes back to even just like shooting, right? The whole term consistency is accuracy, right? If you're zeroing a sight or a weapon system, right, you have to be consistent doing the same way. Otherwise, your adjustments are all off. Right? Your body position has to be consistent. So I said that like consistency is accuracy. We'll apply that to everything. If you can maintain consistency, even during stressful times or times when you didn't get sleep or times when this is going on or you have extra stuff to deal with, that's actually more important during those times to maintain that level of consistency. So like in your case, like, hey, you know what, maybe you have 30 things now you have to do today that popped up. Well, you can't do your 40-minute walk, but can you do 5? You know what I mean? Like it's just that, hey, I can't do my full workouts anymore. I'm not throwing a barbell around because I don't have access to a gym right now. Guess what? I can load up the ruck with different sandbags and I could throw that around. So I'm still getting it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's just same thing, that maintaining the consistency.
My EQ is not strong enough to carry me through everything because I carry all the baggage for everything in my life. And so unpacking that is a horrible thing. So what I do is I enlist cohorts. And so absolutely everything that I do, exactly,
just
my body
and psychologically
bag, you know what I'm trying to say? So
Brian's your emotional support animal?
He is.
Yeah.
He is. So when I'm out anywhere and I'm going, okay, I want to go to bed early. I don't want to get sleep. I want to eat a high, rich meal, this stuff. What I do is I say, okay, what would Marin do? I got my little wristband. And so when Marin and I travel, the very first thing, we go to a healthy food place and we pack it up because if it's there, then I'm going to eat healthy. And then I say, okay, well, Marin, what's he doing right now? Well, he's got to work out. So Marin and we challenge each other. I clearly can't do, I do more parkour and clearly a lot more cardio than Marin does. But what I do is I create this world in my head where I have these challenges that I have to do, not because of me, because I'm too weak, but to make sure that Brian's not pissed. When we travel, I only eat veg, I only eat fish. When we travel, I get good sleep. When we travel, I do. Now, I'm okay with that. I know I'm selling myself out, but me doesn't. So if my emotional register isn't deep enough, and the second part of that is, listen, there's a person listening right now that's going, oh yeah, but this guy was a SEAL, so, he said, handed, silver spoon. No. Every one of us is a damaged, broken little girl that's scared to death of the world and our environment. And we've all got skin knees and like a sieve, our emotions leaking out. And guess what? It doesn't take a lot of money. It takes you to say one day or day one. It takes you to get up this morning and go, today I'm cleaning all that shit out of the fridge. I mean, the biggest investment that I've ever made for me was to build the gym downstairs. And it wasn't really hard because I stole most of the equipment. And what I didn't have, I got donated from some sketchy sources. But the idea was you have to say, this is the line. This is the day that I'm going to get up and do it. And it's hard. From people like me, it's hard. I look at Marin, not so hard because, Marin is mentally tough. But I want you to say, Steve and Marin, for those people out there that say that they can't do it, what's going to get them to the finish line? How do they get up and bootstrap it and go to work tomorrow? What's a good way of thinking of that?
No, I think you hit on a lot. You hit on a lot of it. It's basically just having. It's basically saying, hey, I choose to commit to this. And I think a lot of it is getting confidence and comfort through routine. And I always think of this in terms of routine. I don't know if this was your experience as well, Brian, but when you deploy, you go back overseas, you're going back to Iraq, going back to Afghanistan, you've been there before, but maybe now you're deploying to a different area. And so you deploy there with your unit, and you're waiting to, maybe you guys will do a couple of turnover operations together, a joint group, but you cannot fast enough get into that routine where you're in your permanent place that you're going to sleep, where the chow hall is, you've got all your gear put up, and you just, and then you're like, all right, I got my battle rhythm. I'm going to wake up. We're not doing operations. I'm going to be in the gym here. Chow's at 0700, and so once you get that kind of, you set that routine, if you can commit to the routine, then everything else kind of falls in place. Then you can say, all right, well, I don't feel like getting out, but I've got this framework, and okay, it gives you. Otherwise, you're sitting on your ass all day watching Netflix on your second.
So true.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah. I mean, you guys both hit a lot on it, but same thing for me. It's like that's why I've done this for years, only because I used to have a lot of sleeping issues. It took a long time for me to figure it out. But, it's getting up, but I have no problem being wide awake at 3 and 4 in the morning. You know what I mean? So, but then I just said, all right, well, then I'm going to stick with that. That's wake up time. I get up and start my day. You get what I'm saying? So now that's slowly come to later where I sleep until almost 5 now. But for me, that works. It's getting up. You know what? I wake up and I'm like, man, I'm dead tired. I slept like crap. Like, okay, I'm just going to take the dog and do a half-hour walk today. I'm not going to be able to throw the weights around, but it's still taking that time for myself, because I don't care who you are, getting your ass up and not hitting that snooze button is always going to be better for you. That 15 minutes or 5 or 20 minutes extra of sleep is just not going to help you. And so I think taking that initial step of getting that routine is always difficult. And I always do it first thing off the bat, because I know, like, it's just like, it's a ticking time, or ticking clock, right? It's countdown from when I wake up. And I've only got so much energy. I've only got so much gas in the tank. I've only got so many calories I can burn. So if I try to put something off till later in the day, I know that there's a good chance I'm going to come up with 100 excuses on why I can't get it done.
Absolutely.
So if you just, you're forcing yourself to, it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable. You get all the sayings, all that stuff. It's so funny that we've got all these different sayings that come out, like, you used a bunch, attitude and effort. It's this, and because they get used so much, everyone forgets how powerful they all are. Like, they've been written down and said over and over and become
for a reason.
For a reason.
Exactly.
It's the whole, make your bed. Like that's the oldest one in the book, is make your bed. And no one realizes how powerful that is. You get up and accomplish one task in the morning. You've started your day off with a win. You started it in the right order, but it's also about organizing your life and staying focused. So all that stuff is interesting, how it becomes cliche. So.
Brian, I would challenge this to our listeners, both of them, and the people that watch us on YouTube. That one guy that calls all the time, he goes, "It's this Family Guy." The idea that I would tell you guys is that negative attention is attention nonetheless. And don't forget that, because your sons and your daughters that are craving structure during their teen years, that their catecholamines are jumping, and that they're not understanding that the neurochemistry of the brain that's stretching things and growing hair in places they didn't think of, they're going to crave it. And either you're going to give it to them or the Bloods and the Crips are. Either you're going to give it to them or they're going to check out and they're going to be based on the rock. There's a very simple number of gateways. And if they don't enter into one saying, this morning I'm going to get up and go for a run, or I'm going to emulate you and I'm going to paint, or I'm going to draw, or I'm going to write, or do these positive things, those negative are all around them. And it's a very easy fall to delve into one.
That's a good motivation factor for a lot of people. I don't know, like I'm horrible at being motivated. I always tell people I have like zero motivation, but I got a lot of discipline, so I could do a lot.
That's a great way.
But some people are. But meaning, like, that's another way to look at it, is like, what do you want your kids to do when they grow up? What are you modeling? What behavior are you showing them?
Well, wait a minute. This is a bad one for you again. Okay, we might want to edit that part out and start over, Brian, with the different one, because Dad going, I tell you what,
yeah,
all you bastards throwing the empty bottle at him. I've seen that many times.
Yeah. So, Steve, I kind of want to like get to a couple things that like maybe you looking back with the experience that you have now, you've transitioned, from military to, from active duty out, which is difficult on its own. It's another challenge in itself. I don't care how long you were in, whether it was 2 years or 20 years, like it's just a process that, they're getting better at setting guys up for success, but it hasn't always been that great. And when you come out, man, it's a grinder out there. So you suddenly lose a lot, but you've transitioned well. You're doing your own thing. You're working with private companies now. So you've had this experience. So if you were like looking back, what are some of those big takeaways, or now looking back on, oh man, like I wish I knew this, or, oh man, I've seen this happen everywhere in every unit and every team, no matter who it was. Like, what are the little gems that you have from your personal life, if you can think of any?
In terms of just the lessons I learned in the military, or in terms of transition specific?
Yeah, all of it. Just how any of those lessons learned, like is there anything that's stuck with you that has worked the entire time through all these different events, right? Through these different types of life changes or different types of jobs that you've had? Like, is there certain ones that have always stuck with you?
Yes, a ton of lessons, and I think people talk about this, is that I think Jocko will talk about like the dichotomy of leadership is being close, but not too close, is really kind of finding, and everything we do in life is about balance.
Mm-hmm.
Is finding those pieces where you're like, all right, I've got to, as a leader, I've got to be connected and have relationships with the people within my sphere of influence. But at the same time, I've got to drive the mission objectives. I've got to drive the organizational objectives. So really seeking to find how I can find that balance. And I think that really comes down to, and I wasn't always able to successfully do that, at least to the degree in which I wanted to. And I think it's like, you've got to, at a certain point, you've got to develop that personal philosophy for yourself. It says, this is who I am. This is what I stand for. And as a leader, you're going to be making unpopular decisions. You're going to be making decisions that are going to cause you to fall out of favor with the guys that work for you, because you're seen as like, now you're just thinking yes man, or you're going to be seen by your leadership as a problem child who's like, like that Captain Crozier, perhaps, right, on the TR, who was, now he's so focused on the well-being of his crew that maybe he's not making decisions in the framework of the national, national security objectives. Strategic focus has kind of been lost there. And in terms of, so I feel like, who are you? Who do you stand for? Where do you want to go? And how do you want to be seen? And so for us, it's like, as parents, as organizational leaders, when we navigate through this COVID thing, how do we want to be seen as, what kind of a job did we do?
Yep.
Do we model good behavior for our kids? Do we provide leadership and value in the world? And so I look at that in terms of just being a military guy and transitioning. I feel like I had it pretty easy. Easier than a lot of people, because I kind of left the SEAL teams in 2015. And even though I took a job as a SEAL up at boot camp, I kind of ripped that, it's a very gradual kind of thing. Whereas if I was in Virginia Beach and had a retirement ceremony and the next day woke up in my bed with no Navy, it would be, but I think for veterans that are, or for military folks that are transitioning, I mean, really find out look at exactly what you want to do in terms of, not that you can always find your dream job, not that you can always pursue your passion, but really think about what kind of value you can bring, and let that drive your decision making. That's kind of what it did for me. I was like, I'm good at instructing. I'm good at, speaking. Let me figure out how I can take that in a message and help people.
No, that's a good message. And it's always about, you said it right there. It's, what value do I add to yourself, to your family, to your organization, to your team? It's like, as long as you're focused on how do I add value to this mission or this job or whatever it is that I'm doing, then at least you're helping out, right? Because you get into something new and you're not a subject matter expert at where you used to know everything really well, and now you got to have a new process or a new place that you're starting from, or whatever that situation is, right? I was like, well, what can I do right now to add value? It's like I gave my brother some advice, actually, before he went off to boot camp and buds and everything, and he's like, well, we talked a little bit. Well, Christmas, we almost got a fist fight on the front lawn because I had to put him in place because he had kind of a bit of an attitude before he went in. And when I had to tell him, like, hey, dude, no one cares how big of a stud college football player you are, how big, strong, fast you are. There's going to be some dude who's half my size. Because my brother's like twice my size. I go, there's going to be some dude half my size who's just going to tear you up and he's going to eat you. So I had to break him down a little bit. But then when I gave him one of the things I said, I was like, hey, look, when you're going through there, I go, volunteer for everything. I go, someone's going to say, hey, we need a guy for this, or you need to go do this. Like, I go, just volunteer for everything. I go, it's going to suck because you're going to be tired. Everyone's going to be hiding out. Like, maybe they won't ask me. I go, volunteer for everything. I go, that you're going to meet someone, you're going to make an impression. You're not going to think anything of it. Then 2 years later, that guy's gonna be like, oh yeah, you helped out when this, and I remember, and they're going to hook you up in some other way. I go, and plus you're going to learn other stuff that no one else did, or you're going to get in. And he's like, hey man, that actually worked out great. But he would then do it like, they were like, hey Marin, you know anything about, boat motors? And he's like, yeah, inboards, outboards, what do you got? And he knows nothing. And
Yeah.
I'm like, that's perfect. Because it's
Time
like,
out. Right. You're about to get schooled.
But same thing.
Initiative, but it's got to be good initiative.
Yeah. So, but it's like, but that's the idea of is that anywhere I go, it's like, all right, even if I'm the lowest guy in the totem pole, or I've worked with guys who have been on teams where they've seen like they're all backgrounds like you with a lot more experience than and I'm sitting there like, all right, well, I gotta pull my own weight here. What else can I do? And as long as what you're doing adds value, the rest of the team sees that. The leadership sees that. The team sees that. And they know you care about mission. And the next thing you know, all the doors are opening up and you're getting a call 2 years later. Hey man, we need some work down here. Can you come do it? It's weird how all that stuff works. And it's just about focusing on adding value, like you just said.
Well, this pandemic is the end of entitlement. So a lot of people figured out what they were worth during this pandemic because they were so easily replaced or didn't show up and the world didn't collapse. And sometimes we need to know that. We need to know sometimes that guitar behind Marin's right shoulder is just a prop, and thank God he would never play that son of a bitch because we would bleed from our ears. But no, I mean, the problem that I run into all the time is I try to be humble, and there's certain circumstances and situations where you can be that. Yeah, not on a podcast, Dick Brain.
When do you try to be humble?
But you shut up for a minute. But the idea is the same thing. Is when you're not the smartest guy in the room, sometimes you got to take a step back and sit down and listen to everybody else. Marin and I work in this program for DARPA, and everybody's a PhD and a doctor and a genius and everything else. And you know what? I know my stuff works, but I got to sit down, shut up, and watch the mathematician go and do his part too. So if everybody is leaning forward and everybody is contributing, we'll get through this. But it's also going to expose the weakness. It's going to expose that person like a neon glow stick that's not pulling their weight. And I think that's important as well.
Well, I think so often we, as Americans, this goes back to something you said earlier, Brian, is why aren't people willing to do things? Why is because we look at YouTube stars, we look at influencers, and we like to make the assumption that they had it easy, right? That that came naturally, and they forget just that how many people who are successful are because they put the work in. You talk about, Brian, that you don't have the motivation, but you have the discipline, right? A lot of people talk about that. There's one like, I don't know if you heard of Jim Wendler. He's a strength guy. 5'3", right? He always talks about, discipline over motivation. Because motivation's great. It makes us feel good. It gets us to the door, right? It gets us to want to join Marine Corps, join the SEAL teams. But somewhere between the start of that journey and the finish, the motivation's not going to be there, right? It's going to be the discipline that's going to get you, aligned. And so that's what's required now is it's, hey, we got to put the work in. Because if we don't put the work in, we are not going to be able to adapt and pivot to make this transition piece to make what the new normalcy is going to be on the back end. And so, we got to be committed.
And Steve, I would go one step further, and I think your assessment is spot on. I think that we're in violent agreement on this. I would say go to whatever it is you do, when you're teaching, when you're up there, we used to have to do this with the young trends and wonderful law enforcement professionals and first responders. They would get up there and I would say the very first thing is go through with your eraser and cut out all the crap that's extraneous, all the stuff that's self-promoting and all of this other stuff, and get down to, and then once you've got those elementals and it's perfect, now start building your story. Now start telling us a little bit more about you, because when the moto's at the end, if I'm done with all the platitudes in the moto and you didn't give me a gem of wisdom, I don't got that pearl in my hand, then guess what? You just wasted my 40 minutes or 60 minutes or my keynote address.
No, it's good. Yeah.
So Steve, do you see any common like common themes or patterns among like some of the private sector folks that you work with some of the issues that they have and what they're trying to do and why they bring people in like you? I mean, is there a typical like recurring thing? Because there's a lot of ways, I mean, especially when you get into like, you know, organizational management and structuring and how companies work and operate and leadership and culture and this, like there's a ton of different, there's a lot of ice cubes in that tray, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so do you have any like common themes that you see where you know companies need to focus on, or where they have issues with and don't know how to address them? Like you get what I'm saying? Like they're having an issue and they don't know how to deal with it. Like what are those other typical patterns and the issues that you see?
Well, there's only so many hours in a day, and a lot of times, you know, you're so focused on production right now. Okay, we're so focused on execute right now in terms of you know, providing the value to the stockholders, that we're like, we don't have time to train. We don't have time to train. You know, yeah, maybe there's some folks in the organization that are going to innovate, but generally we're not going to take the time to prepare. We're going into a sales call, sales meeting. You know, I don't need to done this before. Okay, we've just got done. Yeah, we've been doing pretty well lately. There's no need to really assess and analyze that sales call that we just had. There's no need to sit around and discuss it. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier, is what I bring is to say, okay, let's have a comprehensive framework that considers all of it, that considers the contingencies, and know that you're going to address each one of those categories. Know that you only have so many hours in a day to get after each one of those things. But if you don't do it, but you're aware that it's there, and you're aware that I'm taking a risk if I don't put this much time into training, this is what could happen. And I think most organizations, they don't, for whatever reason, they're not good. And it's things we do great in the military, right? It's our after action review process. We're so good, and we do it for a couple of different reasons, right? We do it obviously to get lessons learned. We use it to to get them, to disseminate them so other people can use it. But we also do it, you know, as a way to really establish that culture of accountability, right? If we,
Absolutely.
you know, for us, we get done doing CQB, right? We get done, and now we're going back up to the whiteboard, and we're like, you were in here, you did that, you were over there, you did this. So you're going to get called out, and we create that culture of accountability. We give that very succinct and actionable feedback in the military. And a lot of times the organizations are not willing to do that. They're not willing to do it because they don't see value in taking the time, or they don't really know how to give feedback in a way that is actionable and useful.
No, I would totally agree with the after action review, whether that's for a single small operation or training exercise or whatever the sales call, like you just said, or you're looking overall at an organization as a whole, because that feedback, man, I thrive on it. It's like, you know, obviously to the point, this has to do more with being in the Marine Corps than the psychological and emotional abuse growing up. But like when someone gives me a compliment, it's hard because it's like, no, you're supposed to tell me what I did wrong first. Like, you know what I mean? It's that sit down, and same thing when I would do it as a
Who
teammate.
gave you a compliment? We need to get to this right. So, because I need to fire that bastard.
So it's the same thing as if I'm running the team and like we do training, whether real mission, doesn't matter. It's just like, all right, I'm going to go first. All right, here's what I did wrong, right? Here's where I screwed up. Here's what I
Absolutely.
did. This was the point of failure for me. I should have done this. I should have let you. And then you go around the room, and then it's very, you know, it's difficult. Those conversations can get very difficult. And I've noticed too, especially when you're not used to that, you know, in the private sector, things are different. You have to word it differently. I get it. But having that, like you said, that accountability as a team and personal accountability, and it starts with that leadership going like, hey, you know what? this is what I did wrong. This is how I should have done it. This is what you need to do. Now, what did you do wrong? And people go, oh yeah, I could have handled this situation differently. I didn't have to react like that. But it's just like you said, that preparation and training and all that stuff. Like, I see my wife doing sales calls, stuff like that, or doing whenever we're working at home, and like same thing. I'm like, what did you do to prep, or how did you account for this or account for that? And she's good at where you can tell some people. I've heard her conference calls, and they're hilarious, because I'm like, hey, you need to tell that guy to shut the fuck up. And she's like, I can't say that. I was like, all right, well then you need to tell that guy what he adds no value to the situation. You don't respect his opinion. She's like, I can't say that either. And I'm like, well, you got to come up with a way to get that guy off the phone call, because he's ruining it for your own company. He's doing this, he's doing this. She's like, how did you know that? I was like, just listening in while I'm typing something, I can tell, like, oh man, he's got to stop. He's got to pull back. And she's like, okay. I was like, you need to take that approach when you're listening. Think big picture, look up and out, just don't look down and in. And she's like, oh, I see what you're saying. He came in here when he shouldn't have. He should have waited for me to finish this part. And I go, no need to reinforce fires if they weren't needed, and it's just funny how I think it translates directly over into private sector, but they sometimes have a hard time seeing that. I don't know.
Well, I like what you said about when you talk about debriefing, starting with yourself and acknowledging things that you could have done better. And that's definitely things that you don't see a lot in the private organizations that I've worked with. And when they do, and a couple of ones that I do where they're like, yep, I didn't get this right. And they're like in the executive suite. I mean, I'm like, man, that I don't know. I'm like, that gives me goosebumps. I hope you all are seeing this, because what's funny though is that you think if you're not going to talk wrong, you think that people aren't going to know it. Of course they are, right? And you think that organizational leader fails to acknowledge mistakes that were made. You think it won't occur to people, and that's not the truth, right? Of course they know. They're not stupid, but you miss an opportunity to establish credibility. You miss an opportunity to demonstrate humility, to get people more bought in, more like, yeah, I guess this is an organization that I want to kind of invest more in, and it's sad to see that.
Yeah.
I think in crimes, you see recidivists are responsible, a small group of people are responsible for the large part of the criminal activity and their behaviors. And I think one of the things in corporate America that I see is the same is true. You've got a couple of people that started something, and it's a really great thing that they started. And now guess what? They're locked into that, and they're not going to look elsewhere because it's always worked for them. And then you've got the performers, and that small band of performers are juggling and spinning all those plates and moving the company forward. And then the soft underbelly, where the mistake is, where the stress fractures are, is never going to get exposed. But when it does, it's going to be catastrophic. And that's what happens during school shootings, and that's what happens during domestic violence incidents that spill over. And that's what
insider threat. That's the guy that's stealing.
That's
from
where
the
it
company.
is.
It's all.
Training separates. It creates a behavior that is not going to fall apart at the first big gust of wind.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I mean, we appreciate you coming on, man. And I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about specifically about what you're doing and what you got going. I know you're right outside of Chicago. We actually have a good amount of listeners from that area. So some of them might yeah. So it's as I told you when we were on the phone, it's my hometown. So I love Chicago. I'm always partial to it. I think it's the greatest city in the world. But I know you're right in that area. So I don't know if there's anything you got going on near you that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, nothing specific. Right now, I'm just trying to, do a bunch of speaking gigs, and of course, those all get shut down. Those are the things that I like doing. I love engaging with people, whether it's on stage or whether it's in a smaller workshop session. But now I got to be like everybody else. Right now, I've got to pivot. I've got to adapt. And so now I'm figuring out different ways that I can add value. And sometimes it's just like, hey, if people want to reach out and get me. Get my email, steve@stevendrum.com. My website is stevendrum.com, and just ask if they're struggling, and I can help them maybe with providing some value. Then I'm happy to do that. And of course, doing stuff with organizations, doing some WebEx style presentations for them also.
Right. Yeah, I'll definitely put your links up in the detail episodes of the show and share all that stuff out as well, man. So we really appreciate you coming on, man.
And let's do something together. Let's plan something outside of this pandemic. We love Chicago. I'm sure our paths cross a bunch of times, and it would be great to see you again in person.
Absolutely, I'm down, man. Just say the word. I come on a podcast. Want to talk about the things that you're doing, but I'm like, I told Brian, I'm like, I just want to come on and see what this conversation is.
Yeah.
I don't even care. I think it'll be fun. It'll be entertaining. So
I was like, done.
I appreciate you having me on.
It's been a blast, Steve.
We appreciate you coming on, man. All right. Steve Drum, really appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on. Everyone listening, thanks for listening. We appreciate it. Don't forget, training changes behavior.